You're standing in a Moscow basement in 1952, and in front of you sits the BESM, a machine so massive it fills an entire room with vacuum tubes glowing like a cathedral of light. I'm Jacob, and what you're about to witness is how one Soviet mathematician built the fastest computer in the world, by hand, while the West wasn't even watching. In just a few years, Sergei Lebedev would drag the Soviet Union into the computing age, but first, he had to understand something the Americans hadn't yet, that speed itself was a weapon. Sergei Lebedev was born in 1902 to a railway engineer in St. Petersburg, back when it was still called that name. He studied electrical engineering, but by the 1930s and 1940s he was working on something nobody outside the Soviet Union knew existed: early computing machinery. While Alan Turing was writing his theoretical papers in England, and American companies like IBM were still selling punch card machines for accounting, Lebedev was alone in a Soviet research institute, thinking about how to make a machine that could actually compute at speed. The war had interrupted everything. But after 1945, when the Soviet Union realized what atomic weapons meant, and what kind of mathematics you needed to design them, Lebedev's work suddenly became essential. In 1950, the Academy of Sciences in Moscow gave him a mandate: build us a fast calculating machine. Not a theoretical one, a real one, now. The BESM, which stood for Bystrodeystvuющая elektronная shetnaya machina, meant high-speed electronic calculating machine. The name itself was an act of will. Lebedev and his small team, working in a Moscow institute, had no detailed blueprints from the West to copy. There were no manuals. There was no template. What they had was Lebedev's understanding of electronics, his obsession with speed, and the absolute certainty that if they didn't move fast, the Americans would bury them. By September of 1952, the first BESM was operational. It contained 5,000 vacuum tubes. Its cabinet stretched across a room like a metallic beast. The machine could perform 3,000 operations per second. At that moment, it was the fastest computer in the world. You have to understand the geography of this race to understand how it was possible for the Soviets to be ahead and for almost nobody in the West to know. Computer development in 1950s America was happening in the open. IBM, Princeton, the University of Pennsylvania with its ENIAC, Bell Labs, all of it was published in journals, discussed at conferences, known to the engineering world. The Soviets did things differently. Lebedev's work was classified. The BESM existed in a closed bubble. Western historians of computing didn't even know about it until much later. What the Americans didn't realize was that Lebedev had made a different choice about the architecture of his machine. While American computers of that era were often designed around the idea of flexibility and general-purpose computing, Lebedev built the BESM for raw speed on mathematical problems. He used a floating point system that was elegant and efficient. He organized the vacuum tubes in a way that minimized the distance electricity had to travel, which sounds simple, but was the difference between a machine that worked and one that generated too much heat and failed constantly. The BESM proved itself first on a practical problem: calculating the trajectory of objects in space. This was exactly the kind of work that the Soviet Union needed done, and needed done faster than anyone else could do it. By 1953 and 1954, the BESM was already being used for nuclear weapon calculations. In the shadows of the Cold War, it was performing computations that were literally classified higher than top secret. The American military and scientific establishment had no idea they were falling behind. They would not truly understand the threat until later, when Soviet space achievements began to shock the world. Between 1952 and the early 1960s, Lebedev's team didn't stop building one computer. They built an entire series. The original BESM was refined into the BESM-2, then the BESM-3, each one faster than the last. These machines became the foundation of Soviet computing, They were used not just for military calculations, but for the emerging Soviet space program. When the Soviets were designing Sputnik, when they were calculating the orbits for the Luna probes that would crash into the moon before crashing onto it, when they were training cosmonauts and planning rendezvous in orbit, the BESM computers were doing the math. Lebedev understood something crucial that many Western engineers were only beginning to grasp. The future of technology belonged to whoever could compute the fastest. Speed wasn't a luxury, it was survival. The BESM-3, which appeared around 1958, could perform up to 20,000 operations per second. By the standards of the time, this was extraordinary. It was faster than comparable American machines. The machine still relied on vacuum tubes, thousands of them, packed into cabinets that consumed tremendous amounts of electricity and generated terrible heat. Lebedev's engineers had to design elaborate cooling systems. They had to figure out how to keep the tubes from failing. The reliability of the BESM became almost as important as its speed. A machine that was fast but crashed constantly was useless. What made Lebedev's approach different was his commitment to making these machines work in the brutal environment of Soviet research institutes. There was no climate control as we know it. There were power fluctuations. The machines had to be robust. This pushed Soviet computer engineering in a direction that was, in some ways, ahead of the American approach, which often prioritized elegance and theoretical perfection over practical reliability. By the early 1960s, Lebedev had made the Soviet Union, at least in computation, a genuine superpower. The Americans were beginning to catch up, but for a window of time, it was the Soviets who had the edge. This fact, buried in classified documents and unknown to the public, would influence the entire Cold War space race. Sergei Lebedev died in July of 1974 at the age of 71. He died in Moscow, having spent his entire career in the shadows. His name was not well known in the West. In the Soviet Union, he was recognized as a pioneer, but never with the kind of public celebrity that someone like Wernher von Braun achieved in America. The BESM computers continued to be built and used for years after his death. They became the backbone of Soviet scientific computing. The machines themselves eventually became obsolete as transistors, and then microchips made vacuum tube technology ancient history. But the philosophy that Lebedev embodied, the idea that you could build something brilliant and transformative in isolation, that you could catch and overtake a rival by focusing on a single dimension of excellence, that became part of Soviet engineering culture. When you look at the history of computing and space exploration, the BESM sits in a strange place. It was genuinely revolutionary. It gave the Soviet Union real advantages at a critical moment in history. But because it was secret, because it was classified, because Lebedev and his team weren't permitted to publish or share their work widely, the world didn't see them coming. The BESM computers did their work in darkness. They calculated trajectories for rockets that shocked the world when they worked. They solved equations that had never been solved before. They ran problems that would take human mathematicians months to work through by hand, and almost nobody knew it was happening. This is perhaps the deepest irony of the BESM story. One of the most important and earliest supercomputers in history did its most important work in complete secrecy. Its achievements were classified. Its speed was weaponized. Its innovations were hidden behind curtains that remained closed for decades. When we talk about hidden systems and lost inventions, this is what we mean. Not something broken and forgotten, but something so successful that its success had to remain invisible. The BESM was there. It was real. It was the fastest. And the world almost never knew. The BESM computers were calculating trajectories and solving equations that pushed the boundaries of what humans could accomplish. But what happens when those calculations are wrong? When the computers that should save you instead lead you toward failure? In our next investigation, we're going to descend into the control room of one of history's greatest engineering disasters, where a Soviet rocket carrying men was supposed to reach the moon, and where a single computational error, buried in the margin of possibility, changed everything. We'll uncover what really happened to the N-1, and why the Soviets' race to the moon ended not in space, but in mathematical error. Stay close.